afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started with a brief introduction of Dr. Bussell. As you know, Dr. Bussell, Donna Bussell is a professor in the English and Modern Languages department. She earned a PhD in medieval literature from Columbia University, and also she has multiple master's degrees. Dr. Bussell specializes in medieval devotional literature, hagiography, which I don't know what that is.
Oh, Saints' Lives.
Liturgy and romance from the 12th to the 15th century, England and France. Her research focuses on women's roles in religious discourses and the application of digital humanities methodologies. Throughout her career, Dr. Bussell has earned numerous awards, including the Pearson Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching, and she has also secured multiple research grants. As a prolific scholar, Dr. Bussell has published in respected journals and contributed to edited volumes, with current projects including work on Magdalene liturgies in medieval England and co-edited volume on Marie de France. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bussell.
Thank you. Thanks so much for taking the time today to come. I really appreciate it. It's great seeing so many friendly faces. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to spend a little time in this presentation just kind of orienting folks to what I study. And then we'll get into the actual what did I do on sabbatical, just kind of like what did I do on my summer vacation, or in the case of Britain, winter vacation in the middle of summer. So for those of you who don't know, and I know we have a Magdalene kind of expert here in our midst, in Dr. Larry. Magdalene stories are kind of a mixed bunch, kind of a hodgepodge of things, and they're based on multiple narrative strands. And so these narrative strands include the Christian New Testament reference for the unnamed woman washing Christ's feet with her tears, and that is this illumination right here. So there's Christ's feet, and Mary Magdalene, and a dog making off with a bone. So who seems unimpressed by the whole affair at this point. But in any case, the other that's one of the many stories, and that Luke 7 account is really important in the liturgies. It's repeated over and over in the liturgy, so it's central to a lot of theology and practice that comes after that. She's listed among the women traveling with Christ and the woman who was healed of 7 demons, and that's following that Luke 7 chapter and Luke 8. And this is a group of women who were supporting Christ. So the indication is that they had women of means, they had money, and so a kind of a tiny little insight into this where that support came from. She is part of the so-called Bethany group, which consists of Lazarus, conveniently raised from the dead by Christ, and restored to his family, which consisted of Mary Magdalene and his sister Mary. There's a very famous story of them where Christ is visiting, breaking bread with them, and Magdalene is sort of sitting at Christ's feet, kind of absorbing all the instruction and guidance. And Mary is running around like a crazy person, trying to make sure everyone has something to eat and to get all the domestic stuff done that you do when you have guests. And at one point, Mary complains to Christ, "Hey, this isn't fair. Why does she get to sit at your feet, and I have to run around and do all this work?" And Christ says to Mary, she has chosen the better part. And so, Mary's sort of, the sister Mary is sort of afflicted with being essentially the housekeeper sort of thereafter in much of the legend. Mary Magdalene is familiar from the resurrection stories around the cross, at the empty tomb, in the garden following Christ's resurrection, where he is the person who sees him first. And this other illumination here shows a depiction of Mary and Christ. And this is where the idea of her as an apostle comes from, the apostle to the apostles. So she gets her mission from Christ at that time. And that becomes actually a really interesting point of contention in some of the stories and so forth going forward. The disciples, especially in relationship to the disciples who sort of come to check out the tomb, but then run away. And it's Mary who stays at the tomb and waits and then gets to see Christ in the garden. There's also a Coptic Gospel of Mary, which is apocryphal in the Western Christian tradition. It's fragmentary, but essentially it's about Mary's leadership, Mary Magdalene's leadership within the disciples that are left behind. There's a lot of contention. There's some disciples who support that. There are other disciples who do not. And so that also is part of this tradition. Okay, so background here for my project and some of the key concepts. So I've already described Mary Magdalene, an apostle to the apostle, this iconic woman teacher and missionary, right? This kind of autonomy and visibility that as a figure, which becomes an issue later in some of the heterodox practices that come up in Christianity, and where she is a kind of model, right, at the eve of Protestantism, as a preacher teacher based on Wycliffite teachings about the individual, the place of priests, and so forth, and critiques of priests and the church more generally. So she's a very popular and influential figure through the Middle Ages. For example, I'll talk about this maybe a little bit more later, but particularly in East Anglia and the Midlands, the eastern part of sort of eastern part of the UK. There's an area where, King's Lynn, Norwich, other places where there are a tremendous number of women mystics who become very independent. Teresa Coletti has done work on this group and talks about kind of how spiritual ambition is aligned with economic ambition, and that particular area regionally is an area of commerce. So a lot of the sort of ships and merchandise travel in and out of that. In and out of that area. So she becomes a figure associated with ambition much more broadly. I am responding to Victor Saxer, an amazing researcher from the 1950s and 1960s, who did the foundational research on the Magdalene cult in France, trying to trace its beginning essentially in Western Europe. And it centers around this fight over the Magdalene's relics, because basically he who holds the relics has the imprimatur as apostle to the apostles. So they are basically the chief dog in Christianity. They are the ones who can make the claim to be leaders of an emerging Christian imperium. And at the forefront of this battle over the relics and the battle for the imprimatur of Mary Magdalene is the Burgundian Abbey of Cluny. And Cluny is a very powerful and influential abbey in establishing this voice of consolidating a Christian imperium in the West. And so my interest in Saxer's work, as he's identifying these different sort of places and where the Magdalene starts and lands on Cluny and the Cluniac priories and so forth, as the place where the Magdalene as a cult really takes off. And by the cult, I mean her feast day and people observing that. So it's a little different use than we have in the colloquially when we use that term. And so somewhere in the middle of all this kind of stacks and stacks of recorded liturgies in his volume, there is a type he defines as insular, England, or UK really, as an insular type of Magdalene feast at the Cathedral of Worcester. And and I think Hereford as well. And my question when I looked at that is, what? There's only one. There's only one type. There's only one response to the Magdalene in these liturgies, and that you can describe as English. I thought, I don't know about that. Let me think about that one some more. And so one of the things I was interested in is the expansion of this continental monasticism, especially this French Benedictine monasticism, into insular territories and its coexistence with insular varieties. Because liturgy at that point was kind of a story of affiliation, like who do I belong to? And you can tell by essentially the worship service, by the hours, not for everything, but the Magdalene was one key place in the the observance of the hours. And monastic life, right, is organized around the rituals of prayer and meditation, and readings of the scriptures and patristic texts. And this is just one place where that identity as being part of Cluny was expressed, because there was a very specific, essentially ritual for certain chants and certain lessons, certain sermons. So there's singing and there's readings that was very distinctly Magdalene. This was reinforced and shown to be the case across multiple sets of manuscripts and so forth. And so I wondered if that liturgy of affiliation, liturgy is that mark of affiliation, carried over in England, what it looked like. And so there was a, certainly as we go forward in time, right, there's a need always to create and update the songs and readings for the various days. But there was a kind of core that was at the center of this particular observance, and it made a good spot. And the spot in the cycle of hours that monastic people, that religious people, monks and nuns, and also people in the secular part that the church bifurcates, right? There's a religious set of houses that are monks and nuns, and they're essentially ruled under the abbot. There is, and that is one part. That's the monastic part. And then there's a secular type of religious practice that, in many cases, not always, looks really similar, but they're supervised by the bishop, and that is their head. And again, this is Western Christianity. Eastern Christianity has a completely different organization. I'm only speaking essentially for Western Europe, continental and insular. So in any case, so I'm looking at both kinds of texts, both kinds of houses, and all of that. In other places for these kind of patristic stories and exegesis that come up about the Magdalene, so Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, praised Magdalene for her ardent love of Christ. Bede, the Anglo-Saxon monk in Northumbria, who is very important actually to the insular traditions, focuses on her spiritual devotion, her apostolic mission, and for her as a metaphor for the church. Pope Gregory the Great, who was in the papacy from 590 to 604, more or less, saw Magdalene. He really, in a lot of ways, did a lot of creating the legend, right? Pope Gregory the Great did a lot of that. And she became, in his exegesis, particularly in Sermon 33, but other places as well, Sermon 25, the universal symbol of sin and penitence. She was all mankind. She was sort of universal sin. And to kind of amp this up a little bit, the idea that she was a repentant Protestant, sorry about that. For those of you who are in the Catholic tradition, not repentant Protestant, but a reformed prostitute, which is a whole sort of subtype of hagiography of saints' lives. There's a whole group of women that occupy this, and the reform of these prostitutes. And so she becomes essentially kind of, her story becomes kind of associated with that group, and that a lot of that is Gregory's doing. The descriptions in the New Testament texts may call her a sinful woman, but it does not necessarily mean that she was a Protestant. It may be that she just simply wasn't observant, consistently observant as a Jew, and may have a ton of other meanings. But Gregory the Great fastens onto that, and she becomes a Protestant. I'm going to be stuck on Protestant today. Sorry about that. She becomes a prostitute. Okay. Odo of Cluny, this is pretty central. He is one of the most powerful abbots of Cluny, and he has this sermon about Mary Magdalene, a very long sermon, and it is all over the liturgies. So there are pieces, and again, when I'm tracing like what patterns and where things come from, this sermon is, like Gregory's, is an important marker of these liturgies. And the focus there is on the apostolic mission, which is central to Cluny and the larger practice of Cluny, and also their mission of training priests. They were, as part of this, and as part of the apostolic mission that they felt was embodied by Mary Magdalene, was to train priests and preachers. And so that also shows up in the liturgies and sort of how those are emphasized, to train essentially these doctors, these medical doctors of the soul, and to send them out into the world. He was actually plagiarizing, typing it. There's not really, this idea of plagiarism doesn't really work in the Middle Ages because everybody took from everybody else. Anyway, Honorius Augustodenitus took that some tropes from hagiography and from the threads on reformed prostitutes and advanced this idea of Magdalene as a fallen noblewoman. So again, kind of restoring this idea of wealth. And then later, Jacobo Savonier in the Golden Legend, this manual for preachers, and that he threw all these things into a blender and came up with this massive, sprawling narrative that incorporated as many pieces as he could find, and that becomes a manual for the Dominican and other friars who are the mendicants who go around preaching. So that those Magdalene texts get their purchased far and wide through this, through the development of those orders. Okay, now for the background for this project and some of the key concepts. And I think I already did the slide. Sorry, it was out of order. Let me try that again. I've already said a lot of this. I'll just highlight a couple of things. The liturgy is integral to the life of religious houses. A lot of the liturgical material was known and had impact on lyrics and songs and stories and art, sculpture, all kinds of things to individual devotional practices outside these houses. As you may know, observance is comprised of chants and lessons, which we've already said. It's very much, again, another kind of pastiche or mashup of text, lyrics, and music. And my focus is the Magdalene Feast of July 22nd and the Hour of Matins, which, depending on what house you're in, could happen at 2 a.m., at 4 a.m. It is the longest service. It is divided into 3 segments or nocturnes, and it has the fullest sort of embodiment of all these songs and texts, which is why I am focused on it. There's slightly different formats for monastic and secular houses. Monastic houses, they have a full service and an important feast, which is a very important feast. There's some feasts in the Christian calendar that kind of get honorable mention, and then there's not much on them because they're not really important feasts. But feasts that are important get the full treatment. And in the monastic houses, this is an observance with 12 lessons, and in secular houses, generally, not always, it is 9. Implication for my research. So here I am, I'm in graduate school and I am off to the races with this idea that I'm intrigued by, and come to have to deal with the fact that there's a dissolution of the English monasteries by Henry VIII. And in that process, a lot of the manuscripts were destroyed. Church manuscripts were burned, shredded, done all kinds of things with. And so the extant sources for me are relatively thin compared to the sources for continental houses, with most of what I have. So my question, methods, and goals. So what does the Magdalene liturgy look like in England? Can I fill the gap in between the earlier and the later Magdalene feasts in the liturgy, which is not something people knew much about? What stories are the preferred part of the observance and where? And how do the lessons and chants fit together to convey some message or focus? Because I don't treat these things as sort of random. I mean, my underlying logical premise is that this is done very intentionally, especially considering the importance of the feast. And so there is some coordination, I think, again, probably not all the time, but many times there is a coordination of these texts because it really conveys some principles or ideas or affiliation. So I'm looking for what significance do any groupings or patterns have? Do they align, for example, with regional or institutional affiliations, with order? What ideals are foregrounded? And my methods are pretty basic, locating them, because when you look at catalogs and such, the Magdalene feast is not necessarily listed, even if you find the item in the catalog. So a lot of this has involved me actually having to go to sites and literally open the book and page through until I see if it's there or it's not there. So I've spent quite a bit of time doing that. And of course, transcribing that. Some of that is pretty challenging. My most recent challenge during this sabbatical was going to the Magdalene and looking at the earliest liturgical manuscript that I looked at, from the last quarter of the 12th century, literally was in pieces, and it was on microfilm. I could not see the actual manuscript. I think he would have probably had to have permission from God or something to do that. So I did get to see the microfilm, and I think I literally spent about 5 hours before going through the pieces before I found the Magdalene liturgy, and it was there. And it's very interesting for me as a focal point, because this is very early before a lot of other influences start coming in. So it's kind of a critical sort of point of comparison. And then describing these things, and creating tables and very soon databases, with the idea that I will be able to perhaps, who knows, elucidate groupings or maps. So my idea of fun, and this is one of my published articles, and this is for Cluny, showing the relationship between these different texts. And you can see, you don't really have to be, you have to read Latin, you don't know anything to see there's a lot of similarity right across. And so this is how this travels as a set piece of Cluniac identity. So my findings pre-sabbatical. This is in a book chapter, and in that's that table that I just showed you displayed. It reinforces the Cluniac pattern, or the Cluny pattern, in 2 manuscripts, but suggests regional variation. So there's 2 extant manuscripts in England. There's one from the Lewis Breviary Missal, and the Pontefract Breviary Missal. Pontefract is north, Lewis is south. That's important because Lewis is closer to the centers of power. Closer to London, closer to a lot of things there. Pontefract is north, much smaller in a lot of ways, and there are definitely distinctions. Lewis follows Cluny right down the line until the 3rd nocturne, and then it engages in what Saxer identified as the insular pattern. So it switches up for England. So again, responding to those regional habits or praxis or ways of affiliating. Pontefract Priory really just kind of does its own thing, and shows a very strong affiliation with Bede, but it's quite distinct. And in the Cluniac pattern, including Lewis, and to a small extent Pontefract, the emphasis on pastors and doctors as healing sin. And the Magdalene's tears and that kind of penitence. And then the Pontefract Priory goes on. He uses what is sort of Bede's Augustinianism in focusing on the individual praxis and that ability to reflect and that spiritual inner life. So he gets away from the institutional thing, from focusing on pastors and penitents, to really think about that inner experience. In the Cistercian form, and that's a journal article, there are earlier and later versions. The Cistercian reform is a reform of the Benedictine practice at Cluny. The monastic practice, headed by Bernard Clairvaux, who was a very interesting figure for a lot of reasons. Won't go into that now, but a very powerful figure in this era. When the Cistercians broke with Cluny, their Magdalene liturgy early on aligns with Cluny, so they're basically doing the same thing. As it begins to reform over the 13th and 14th century, they change up the Magdalene liturgy. They shift to the Song of Songs. They shift to this affective connection to God. So they're not talking about pastors. They're not talking about penitents in the same way. They completely change their focus, and very consistent with the teachings of Bernard of Clairvaux. Okay, here I am, finally at last. I have made it to sabbatical. So thanks to the Harry Endeavor Berman Sabbatical Award that enabled me to do a lot of work on about 15 manuscripts. On the right, I am at Oxford at the Bodleian. That is the Goff Lateran Liturgical 1. Sitting on the table. It is really one of the biggest service books I have ever seen. It's literally kind of like this big. It's clearly meant for essentially a kind of group use. The one on the right is an ordinal from a Cistercian house. It's earlier. It's obviously earlier because you can read the script. And what ordinals do is they tell you what to do at different feasts. So this one I'm pointing to, you can probably see the Magdalene's name in there. You can definitely see that G and the D in Magdalene, and it talks about having this full service for the celebration. So this is a full feast. All right. All right, so I saw about 15 manuscripts. I took photos of several others as I was running out of time for later transcription. And so here's the sort of baseline information here. Insular observance are shaped by something called the use of serum, which comes out of the Salisbury Cathedral. And it again becomes a really defining pattern. And again, really distinctive chants and lessons for the Magdalene piece and many other things. Although there are still remaining distinctive exemplars of the uses of Cluny and the Cistercian. So these imports continue to sort of exist. If the Salisbury rite, the Sarum rite, starts in the 11th century, it's definitely an insular rite, along with the York rite, which Henry VIII quashes. And this is a power play between, again, South and North, for which is the preeminent prelate, who is closest to the king. And all of that, but those York uses are out there. So that's essentially the kind of playing field as I'm looking at these surviving manuscripts. These are the lessons that, so there are three groups of sort of stories that are foregrounded in these different liturgies. And one of them is this story from Proverbs 31. It's about the wise wife and what this wise wife does every morning, every day for her household. And this is highly favored by the Cistercians and some other communities. I found it in 6 manuscripts. It reflects the Roman Missal, but it also reflects the priorities of the Cistercian rite, essentially, and the ways in which that emphasizes women, but in this metaphoric way. There is the second narrative strand is the Odo sermon on Mary Magdalene, often combined with the Proverbs 31. We see this a lot in the Dominican and Franciscan texts. The preaching friars, there's a few uses of York mixed in here that also use the Odo sermon. But that Odo sermon, again, the kind of apostolic mission that is so central to that sermon is foregrounded here. And then there's the Gregory the Great. Quite sure what happened to my Zoom people. Oh, apparently I was not sharing my screen. I thought I was. Apologies to those of you who are on Zoom. Just a moment. And I will make my PowerPoint available, so apologies there. Okay, the third narrative strand in the manuscripts I reviewed was from Gregory the Great. This is often associated with the Cluny and the Cluniac, but also the Sarum, some of the Sarum rites as well really favor this idea. Again, the focus on penitence, the focus on the Magdalene as a symbol of universal sin, and the reformed prostitute. The chants. There are just a huge number of variations. So even though we have this rite, the Sarum use that is very dominant, people did freelance, and they freelance pretty much in the third nocturne. So the first two often follow the program, and then the third nocturne seems to be the place where people got creative or added new things or tried new combinations. There are still earlier models in the Sarum, but it doesn't really become. Sarum doesn't seem to become dominant in the manuscripts I'm looking at, even though it's introduced in the 11th century until the 13th century. And so it's the dominant rite, but it actually exists along many more patterns earlier on. And this is one of my questions: can I fill in that early piece for the Magdalene observance? And so this is part of filling in that early piece. And so and this is the liturgical 36 I was telling you about. It's from 1173 or maybe 1184 in a collegiate church in Penkridge and in Staffordshire, which is northeast of Birmingham. It's a pre-conquest royal chapel, so which makes that a really interesting exemplar. And then there's a few more Cluniacs I found. Let's see. In any case, additional changes that come with the Dominicans and the other preaching friars is that the Magdalene becomes a kind of driver of change in terms of the kinds of spiritual work that gets explained and given to the laity to do. So it becomes a very, very popular figure, becomes much more available to a wider audience through all of this. And I've already mentioned that the larger context is the economic and devotional ambitions, not everywhere, but in some regions like East Anglia, that are connected to commerce and that later become connected to potential heresy through heterodox practices, through the idea that lay people can preach, through the idea that women can preach and teach. And by the way, this example of the Magdalene preaching and teaching is very early. There's a 12th century breviary, for example, that shows the Magdalene with her little, rhetorical teaching finger up. And she's teaching the disciples. And so that idea is all the way through, but it really gains purchase in these later practices. And so the summary here, the Magdalene feast in England, it foregrounds in the chants as well as the narrative. So we're thinking about the chants. The Bethany group, you'll remember Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, and Mary, they become a leading apostolic family. They become a kind of social, spiritual network, right? And again, in the context of these later years, when there's Wycliffe, the accusations of lawlessness, these kinds of beginning stirrings of what will become the Protestantism and the break within the Catholic Church. It is embedded by Henry VIII, who decides that he's the head of the church. Thank you very much. Which is, and he'll have his own church, thanks. And so this is one of the reasons that those, in fact, it's the main reason that those, there's a dissolution of the monasteries. And so we get a lot of other things that are happening in these chants, a lot more of Magdalene's affective identity. And that's important for the way, especially lay people as well as religious people, conceive of their own internal practice, their own devotional practice, and also a certain degree of autonomy comes with that. If you're focused on that kind of interior experience, then that that authorizes and gives permission for certain kinds of things. The Magdalene and the Bethany group becomes an intercessory figure, and here begins to overlap with the Blessed Virgin Mary, as VVM is. And so her teaching and missionary apostolic stories really gain. There's something about the Provençal legends where she takes off on a ship, which she's essentially tossed out of Palestine, gets on a ship with all of her followers and her family group, and is essentially heads for France, lands in Marseille, converts the king and queen in Marseille, does all sorts of miracles, and then this is where that Bethany group really kind of takes off. At the end of her life, she goes off to a cave and lives this kind of ascetic life. But again, that kind of preaching, teaching Magdalene, very, very important, and that Provençal story also shows up quite a bit. So in totality, this is suggestive of the influence of patrons and other audiences in finding the Magdalene a kind of broader canvas for spiritual ambition and other kinds of ambition and ideas about autonomy. And so I think I've said a lot of these. So I want to end by, or close this out by looking at some of the illumination programs. So what kind of woman is the Magdalene? So this is just for reference. This is Donatello's Penitent Magdalene from 1440. You see a depiction of extreme asceticism, which of course lets him show off as a artist, his understanding of human anatomy. But it's also a kind of ideal that serves many patristic and institutional purposes, both related to gender and related to laity and related to just the ideas about fallibility and sin and so forth. And then this really contrasts in some ways the penitent, the reformed harlot, who continues to need penitential practice. So being reformed isn't enough. You have to sort of keep going in the penitential practice in a very very obvious way. This is also part of the harlot narratives in this ascetic life. Although those are complex in different ways, which I can't address here, but that's there. And this is really a contrast with the preaching and teaching Magdalene and her family, which is familiar from the Provençal legends. This is one of the manuscripts I looked at. This is the breviary. It is from the East Midlands, Norwich. Again, that kind of that area I was talking about is very associated with commerce. And so one of the interesting things here, the person that this was made for was probably secular clergy. But so here you see a book in her hand. That's a new piece of iconography. You see her unguent, her little jar of unguent that she used to treat Christ's feet with his tears and unguent, right, were her two things that she used in that act of devotion. And so this unguent container, which comes in various shapes and so forth, is always there. It's a lot of times it's in her, in fact, almost all the time, it's in her left hand in the iconography. But sometimes there are different things in the right hand. Sometimes nothing at all in the right hand. But the book here is really an interesting addition. And so this is this book is amazing. It's got so many imaginative illuminations. It emphasizes tears, but also the insight and love of Christ in this figure. She's again an intercessory figure aligned with the Virgin. Suggests again the kind of mixed life, active as well as interior life, which is really different from the penitent who lives out in the desert. This is the largest and most lavish service book I looked at. It's the most lavish one to survive the Reformation. It is from the Benedict Abbey of St. Mary's in Sherborne, which is in Dorset, which is southwest of London, probably made for its abbot, Robert Bruying, and it includes the Sanctorale but minimum text. So there's not a lot on the chants and lessons here because of the type of service book it is. But the decoration program is really interesting because it's consistent with other decoration in liturgical programs that elevate the Magdalene status while signaling penitential history. So she continues to hold that alabaster jar in her left hand, but you can see she's very royally dressed. So that this is again probably a nod to the patron, but in doing so, it also kind of elevates this figure. And so there is this kind of interesting background in some of the illuminations I saw across manuscripts, which is this kind of black earth. And I think that's suggestive, metaphorically of her past. And it stays there. In this particular thing, picture, it is of course associated with the resurrection, and it's also paired with the verse Maris Sabbat ad monumentum floris florens, which is stood outside the tomb Frank. Trying to get that to work, doesn't it? Okay. Here's another piece of the shifting iconography that I really like. Now, this is one of those places where I'm starting to look to the continental manuscripts as well as the insular manuscripts and seeing where there are similarities or differences with those manuscripts. And so we continue to see this shifting iconography. There is a fantastic manuscript called the Legenda Santissime Maria Magdalene. So it's huge. And it is just full of stories, all kinds of stories, romance stories, everything associated with Magdalene. It just goes absolutely wild with all things Magdalene. And it has many fabulous illuminations. Here you have the Bethany group healing a sick woman. And again, you have similar iconography here. I'll show you in a minute. There's this taper. I'll put an arrow in for this one. So the taper is here, that candle basically. This is the Magdalene. This is Lazarus. And this is Mary, Sister Mary, who gets to do all the housework. And so this is Mary Magdalene. There's her little jar. And she is angels in attendance and so forth. And so this is a healing. Lazarus becomes a bishop in these kinds of later narratives. And so this iconography of the taper, I think, is interesting. It speaks to illumination and all the sort of metaphorical ideas that come with that. I want to show you, this is not the Magdalene, this is the Virgin Mary, but I just want to show you another instance where that taper is used. And this is in the Victoria and Albert. It's part of the stained glass exhibit there. And so you see the same thing. There's a little green arrow pointing that, and there's a taper that she holds. So this is, that's Christ there kneeling. And so, again, bringing light, bringing illumination, and also kind of intercessory kind of figure. It's not really aligning her with a priest, but it's certainly putting her essentially on the same stage. So, we haven't talked about any women. All the texts I've talked about are from men's houses. Sometimes mixed, but mostly men's. Sometimes a double house, and that's what I mean by mixed. I don't mean men and women living together. I mean you have a house where there's men in one house, and then there's women in another, and maybe like a connection between them, and that's a double house. So what are the nuns up to? Well, I wish I had more stuff, but here's some interesting stuff. One of the things that we know about the convent drama at Barking and at Wilton, which is another woman's house, and elsewhere, maximized performance of all the Marys in the Easter week for all their services and processionals. They had extended speaking roles, singing, movement, processions. They kind of embodied, authority through the Magdalene. And each convent makes choices about whether or how to include men in these performances, but they are all women-centered. And so one of the ways that this shows up in the architecture is the building program at Barking Abbey, and alterations in the 13th century church. Now, Barking Abbey has been around since, at least since the 10th century, earlier, but Vikings. In any case, Vikings and pirates, Peter. That's the end of Barking for a little while, but it reformulates. And each and each of these places, of course, go through multiple building programs if they have the resources to do that. And Barking Abbey is very close to the Royal House, and so it has family networks and so forth, and cross-channel networks into France that provide it with resources. It's a very important abbey, and it's one of the ones I study. And they made shrines to their founding abbesses and female saints much more visible in their church. And this includes chapels dedicated to Mary Magdalene and the Blessed Virgin, the separate chapels, but each of them are dedicated to each of these women. And they use this space, they created a very resonant playing space for women's performances. So this kind of women performing and embodying authority in the company of their founding and very powerful abbesses and Mary Magdalene along with the Virgin Mary. So what's next? I have a ton of transcribing to finish up because now a lot of these places, for most manuscripts, a lot of the libraries I go to allow you to take pictures. Did not. I did just that when I began this project, that just wasn't even a possibility. So now I'm ordering books and taking snaps of as many things as I can get so that I can go home and transcribe them. Thinking more about the connections to the preaching friars. And things like the Gobertines and the Augustinian canons, and assessing what I can of women's observances, depending on what the extant record allows, and what any comparisons to the convent allow. And so that's it. Thank you. Well, very happy to take questions.
You mentioned that Matins is where we see most of the original poetry. Do we see other parts of the daily liturgical prayer, since it's her entire feast day where things are inserted? Obviously, I don't know. I mean, beyond her name, probably in the Mass, you're going to commemorate her. But I mean, any other examples where there's any type of repetition of legends, or like what you have in the East, a Troparia and Cantacia type of poetic hymns that would be sung, things like that?
Well, and of course, all the Paschal celebrations, right, are full of this. And a lot of these things, you have to be a little bit careful, just because, of course, as you probably know, there's a lot of reuse of things, right? So some things come from the Common of Virgins, other things come from different feasts, and so whoever's putting these things together, revising them over time, can draw from a huge number of items. And so there are things that are very, very specific to the Magdalene that show up in places you would imagine them to be, but there's also a mix of other things, including celebrations for the the Annunciation and the Virgin Mary, all of that kind of thing. Did I answer?
Yeah. I mean, I'm more familiar, I just know from, more familiar with St. James, his traditions and some of the things in liturgy that were done there. His feast day is about a week later. That there's, specific hymns and stuff, but yeah, they're mostly tied to the hours.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, there's certain books that are better to study, obviously breviaries. Sort of books of hours to an extent, against depends, that can be a catch as catch can kind of thing. Missals, if they include a sanctorale, which they don't always, they may just have a little bit, or a tiny section. So it depends on what kind of service book you're looking at. Ordinals, of course, are very abbreviated. So it really depends on the service books that are available.
Do any of your service books have chant included in them? Any type of, markings,
Oh, yes.
either from, Guido d'Arezzo, like where we've actually got staff notation or priest.
Oh, yes,
stuff?
definitely. I can definitely show you, and there's a lot of notated, in fact, that the Goff liturgical one that giant book is notated, the notated breviary result, and it's quite beautiful. I'm very happy to pull it up and share pictures. It just doesn't really apply. It's from the Netherlands, and so it's not really part of my study, but I definitely had to take a look. There's also a wonderful picture of the organist. There's an illumination of so a real celebration of the music there. And I saw Harry.
Yeah, just an observation and a question. Observation is, I'm so glad you got to do this. And although it's the case that some of these manuscripts were on microfilm, I took from your presentation that you actually got to see and confront 12th, 13th century documents.
Mhm.
And what a thrilling thing to be able to do.
It is still thrilling to me that I get to do this.
The other thing is, you mentioned a couple times the Cistercians, and in a couple of interesting contexts, they had a certain take on Mary Magdalene that had to do with approaching God. And then later on, you mentioned their use of or drawing on Proverbs 31, the wise woman, or I'd say capable woman. Can you say a little bit more about the Cistercians?
So the Cistercians, they're a complicated group. The Cistercians were very focused on this kind of affective connection, right? And on this kind of metaphorical relationship to women, but also that they could be the woman, basically, in a relationship to Christ. So in their inner imagination, their affective practice, they could speak as the bride of Christ. So and so the fact that the church is gendered female is part of that. So they're speaking as the bride, the individual, right? But they're also speaking as ecclesia, the church. And so, and of course, the Cistercians, one of the things that they did is they got rid of all of what they thought were the affectations of the Benedictine observance at Cluny and elsewhere, and they were quite ornate. And the churches were very clean. They had like nothing in them. So they really beyond an altar. And so they really focused on that kind of inner experience and didn't want any distractions from that inner experience. And one of the things I didn't realize is how much the places that they put together, their chapels and churches, also were set up so that part of that would be a kind of sensory acoustic experience. So they kind of took away the visual and really emphasized the acoustic. And so many years ago, I went to Rome to study Latin. There was a senior Latinist at the Vatican, Carmelite monk from Minnesota, who was one of the senior Latinists. And he took us to this Cistercian church in Fossa Nova. And you go in and you think there's really nothing to look at, but the ceilings are carved out in a certain way. In fact, my very first slide in here, the reason I chose it, and sort of my own personal reason, is that it reminds me of the inside of Fossa Nova, with those round curved surfaces that were very smooth and didn't have any a decoration on them at any kind. You think, oh, well, how boring, you'd have to sit here. But what makes it special is when you start singing, because it's designed to be just a supreme acoustic space. And so in our group, we had someone who was actually a singer at the Metropolitan Opera in New York, a young man. And so we went to this place, and we were made to sing every morning and recite our Latin by singing. And everybody had to go first before this guy because nobody wanted to sing after him. But nobody. So we went to this place, and apparently he Pater Reginaldus had already spoken to this guy about what we were going to do. We got there, stuck us all in pews, and we started singing. And then we started singing in parts, in harmonic parts, and the layers of sound that came back. It sounded like a few people were like a massive choir. And then of course we enjoyed that, and then the guy really could sing got on there, and he really made it ring out. It was really stunning. So the thing probably to know about the Cistercians is how focused on that sensory and internal experience was for them, as well as the idea that they were looking for a kind of purity of love in which women figured metaphor.
Thank you for this. All of this took me back to grad school. Because Rosemary Radford Ruther was my mentor at Northwestern, and this was her jam, patristics. Here's my question. What drew you to this work? Why this for you? How did this land for you that made you want to study?
Probably a lot of reasons. I sort of entered this a little bit thinking about how women fit into religious life. And what did that look like? And what did that look like in insular territories? I was interested in the kind of presence of women like Clemence of Barking, who, wrote these just sort of amazing texts. And, how did these people fit in? And then the next question became, well, how did the figure of women fit in, more largely into this? And I really like those stories. I like the fact that a lot of the complexity of these stories have to do with conversations that you have to sort of dig out, because they have a kind of a surface level, and then you have to dig in to find the kind of social or political things that are going on. And so the religious language, a lot of times people look at it and they see repetition. They see something that's very boring. I see something that's covering up something else interesting that I would like to find out.
Was there second question, was there one or two particular figures that intrigued you?
Figures in
women.
Yeah. I think it's the women's communities that actually intrigue me, but there's not very much on that. And I ended up going, actually, all of this is about men's communities, so it's not quite the direction I intended to go. But this idea, but Katie Bogius has done, at Notre Dame, has done some amazing work on women's leadership in the medieval church and in England, and so in Barking Abbey. And so, that's the kind of thing I'm probably going to turn toward. I got to decide how much further this project's going to go, if I'm going to actually get a book out of it, or if there's just not enough extant manuscripts for me to do that, and I may end up with one more article, and then I'm just going to have to turn. So that's kind of where I am.
Thank you.
Peter.
Thanks for great talk. It's really interesting. I'm speaking as someone who doesn't really know anything, so forgive the questions. I was really sort of intrigued by the discussion of embodiment and sort of building on Harry's question, right? That you have men using a female figure as a source of embodiment for their religious identity. I thought this was fascinating. So it seems to me to be a project as much about masculinity as femininity, and that you do have like this shifting going on. So I don't know if you wanted to talk more about that. But a sort of very small question would be, do they like encode medical lore into any of these, since she is like seen as like a healing figure with these unguents?
Not here. I mean, I am interested actually in the medieval sort of medical, manuscripts, and there are some really interesting books that I found along the way that are manuals for treating men and women that are often used by women practitioners, because of course physicians don't exist essentially as a group really for quite some time later. And so it doesn't really touch on that, not directly. As far as masculinity and the use of the feminine, Carolyn Walker Bynum has done the foundational work on that. She was actually, I took her historiography class.
Oh, wow.
So I wasn't a history student, so I was there on forbearance, but I took several of her classes actually. And so she really outlines the way in which and other people have followed up on it. There's been a lot of research on this. The way in which men adopt feminine in their internal spiritual and devotional lives, in their devotional imagination. It's really different. I study in some ways men and women do this. It's not one or the other, but it's really interesting when it comes to men. I mean, they see themselves as nursing, doing all of these really feminine things. I kind of like some of the other work that looks at anchorites, which are these lay women, can be religious women who live these incredibly solitary lives, and some of the anchoritic spirituality material from England, where there's a different kind of spiritual imagination where they're like literally fighting the devil, like warriors and so forth. So that whole imaginative space is really interesting to me, and then how it bleeds over into the non-religious life, to the life of lay people, and what they take from that and do with it, like Marjorie Kemp.
So does the gender crossing is mostly an internal, like, imaginary thing?
It is.
And then does that then affect? It sounds like it also does affect like the outside world, though, like how they behave as men, right? So how does this like relate to like medieval constructions of emotion, say, right? So that medieval emotion tends to get a bad rap. Then, right, is this because you have men who are like feeling it okay to be emotional or not? Like, it just seems like there's really interesting dynamics of gender that this empowers. And
I think that has to do with the degree to which you can compartmentalize this.
Yeah.
If it's within the spiritual space or the devotional space, a lot of latitude is allowed because of theology, particularly around the Song of Songs, but other pieces as well. And so there's a lot of room to manage in that. Outside that space is another question. So, and I think women mystics, when they get out into that space, or get out of that space and into the world, I mean, the sexism and threat and so forth that they encounter is quite severe. So.
And then related to that, and bodies and everything, I was thinking as soon as you were talking about how Gregory is so responsible for the reformed prostitute theme, and I was immediately thinking of Mary of Egypt, and then just double checked, like in the 4th century, there's a prostitute, this woman who lives a life of debauchery and everything, and then she reforms, and then she spends 30 years out in the desert, and then she's a very, very influential sort of example in Eastern monasticism for
Mary of Egypt.
Mary of Egypt.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, that popular tradition has got to be known by the name of Gregory. So Gregory or some of the people and traditions probably are what give us these Magdalene traditions about her becoming living 30 years in the wilderness and in France and these other traditions. So I bet that Mary of Egypt ends up contributing to our Magdalene traditions in the West.
Oh, absolutely. They're overlap, actually. Sometimes they're treated as the same character. And in the illumination programs are really helpful here for understanding that. So Mary of Egypt is like just kind of covered in hair. She's called the Hairy Mary, right? She's actually literally like hair all the way down to her toes, back front. Nothing is revealed. But she's completely covered in hair, and this relates to her eremitical life and her life of penitence. That's how it's sort of expressed. Sometimes Mary Magdalene is depicted that way.
Yeah, like the sculpture you showed us there was evoking that.
Yeah, and there are illuminations that have her in the exact same form.
Yeah.
So
and that tied into what he was saying too for me in terms of like what do you see in terms of like embodiment? I noticed that asceticism, practices of fasting and things like that are ways that Mary Magdalene or female and male traditions can kind of overlap in monastic life.
Yeah, but as you'll see from these illumination programs, right? She, so there's that highly penitent ascetic Magdalene, but a lot of the Magdalenes that show up in these illumination programs are kind of fat and happy, right? They are, and they're dressed in royal clothes. So, so how much did that become, a really powerful, it does, again, internally, if you look at Marjorie Kemp, if you look at some of the mystics, right? Internally, that gets depicted, but externally, I mean, Marjorie Kemp goes around wearing white all the time, which causes her a world of grief, but she's pretty well dressed in white. Before that, she's wearing all these gorgeous clothing to church because it's a competition with other women. So, nobody's walking around in rags.
That sounds like the black church.
One day best.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
Oh,
Sorry,
I
how-
get to hear some details. I mean, I talked and I've heard some things that you studied.
Sorry.
Thank you.
But I studied, musicology and music history and medieval music a couple
Mhm.
semesters. And I love the era for a
Mm.
lot of different reasons. So this has been really very interesting to connect some of the dots. And to cut just a couple of the dots are, well, first of all, it's great to see somebody looking at original text.
Mhm.
I mean, that must be a real thrill to just,
I mean, some other people have studied some of these texts. I'm just doing my own.
yeah, well, I guess I'm thinking, I'm just comparing to my experience, which has been, you get for your class, you get this book that has all the key texts, and you can look at them. I even had another semester of transcription, for music. So, but somebody else already put those in the book for us to transcribe. So
Mhm.
it must be something to do.
It is fun. I mean, it's a puzzle too. I mean, and you're trying to transcribe and you get part of something and you leave a blank space because okay, I come back to that. And you just keep going. But there's a lot more electronic tools now that help me suss out what something is. So that's helpful. But people do combinations that are their own combinations, so you can't really rely on the source to tell you what something is. But yeah, that's really fun for me. I love that. So, and I would love to teach something about medieval manuscripts with a medieval book, but that comes up.
The other thing is, one more thing though was just about I was thinking about, I always wanted to study, the courting music because.
Oh, yeah, the
I read a
troubadour.
research paper. Right, the troubadours and the Minnesinger from Germany, right?
Mm.
But they were all singing about this unreachable love, and most of them were, also people who were in the church, right? They write the secular songs, but they're related, must be related to this connection that you were just talking about in
Mhm.
terms of trying to
Mhm.
express love and for a woman, but it could be the church at the same time.
Right,
You
so
put
the
it in
longing,
secular-
all of that,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. But you put it in secular language and then all of these things start to overlap. So,
Yeah, there's some fabulous like debates between men and women in those songs. It's
Yeah.
really amazing. I love that stuff too.
didn't mean to cut off the hand over here, but
No, it's related to that.
Yeah.
That makes me think of the Cantigas de Santa Maria as
Mhm.
another example of that sort of.
Oh, yeah, those are
having
fun.
And set to music. And we actually have the music for it. Quick question. You said that we have the notation for some of these. Do we have an artist that has performed it so that we can listen to it?
Or some of it, I can send you some of that or post some of that. I mean, there are several I
I'm
can.
just curious what it would sound like that we're
Yeah.
telling us about all these manuscripts and we're seeing it.
yeah.
How would we see it actually lived out?
Yeah.
And listen to it and experience
It's
it?
really, I mean, and this is when I go to some conferences and they actually have little groups that do this or we
Yeah.
do it together. It's really fun. So, yeah, so I'll share that when I share my PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you.
There are music ensembles that specialize.
Yeah,
in
absolutely. Fabulous. And Sharon can also help that. Peter.
Really different question. I don't mean to derail this awesome discussion. But if I can, again, coming from the outside, there seems to be some meaning to the term insular in your field that I'm not getting. So if you could help me a little bit.
Sure. Basically,
Because
the whole
England is all
island.
divided up. There's no England.
Right.
And
It's
a lot
that
of these,
whole
a
thing.
lot of these polities, like their connections are across the ocean to the
Mhm.
continent.
Right.
So like metageographically, like what is the utility of thinking about like insular as a concept for this or other forms of like early medieval culture if there are all these cross oceanic connections and
Yeah.
it's all broken up into their own individual political entities anyway? Like, is it because it's like a proto-England that's not England yet? Anyway, so yeah, if you could just.
I mean, so yeah, it is a proto-England, right? Or proto-UK, right? Because we're talking about everything, like the whole island. And the insular territories, right, they're their own place. Even if you have the cross-channel connections and a powerful family in France and all of that, right? It is a different place. It's a different space. It has a different history, a different relationship. And so, is it a single political or 2 or 3 political units? No. It's really essentially the Wild West in the 9th and 10th century. It begins to kind of begin gelling as these various clans start forming kingdoms, Offa the Great, all that stuff. So it does go forward. And part of this fascination for me is watching how that happens amongst these powerful families that go back and forth. And so these networks, especially of the more powerful royal abbeys, and this fascinates me about Barking. It fascinates me about other women's abbeys that are royal abbeys, is how they manage to do what they do because of those connections, because of the cross-channel connections, because of this vast network behind them. So
But
that's
still maintaining a distinctive space.
well, it is a distinctive space. There's water around it, and it's a different place. And so politically, it doesn't become something that we recognize for quite some time, but it is something that medieval people recognize as a distinct region and
Okay.
space. So,
Cool. I was just curious.
yeah, no, I love it. I love it. I get a chance to talk about all this, and I never get a chance to talk about
Well,
all
the rites too, having the serum rite,
Mhm.
the rituals being different too, than you'd have in a continental liturgically.
Yeah. So, yeah, some of them are going to be differences, and some of them are going to be similarities. But I think Cluny was very reticent to send its people and start a house in England because they did well, what we can now call England, insular territories, because they thought it was going to lose control. So that's another marker of how they saw this as a different space. Is that it took them a long time to put Lewis. Lewis was the first one, and there was a huge fight about establishing Lewis in insular space because it was out of Cluny's control and direct supervision.
Did they have a name that they used? Or like, because insular seems like something we were imposing on them.
Mhm.
Like, what did they call their space?
Different things depending on the region.
So like, those is like Northumbria and
Right.
Anglia and
So
all
people
these
call
things.
their
But
place
they still,
what
like
it
someone in
is.
Northumbria still saw like that they had something in common with someone in Anglia, even though they're very distinct. And they
Yeah.
had connections across, even
Yeah.
though they had connections. So someone in Northumbria had a closer connection to someone in what becomes France than with something that they had
They have an
in common
insular
in East
identity.
Anglia, right? But they still had this idea that East Anglia and Northumbria were in the same space.
Because you're asking essentially about identity. Did they identify as being part of these insular territories?
Yeah.
Probably not until later, but
But
they perceived as the space as distinct from the continental space.
Okay.
How they self-identified, how they identified their communities, or of course local and regional and familial, right? Of going cross-channel and wherever else they were related. Maybe cross-channel and also maybe to the royal house located in the London area.
Right.
So they just don't follow our rules for for
No, I mean,
for geographic
that's what makes it
names.
fun to
Yeah.
study. But I mean,
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
yes, but it's like have this extra imposition of like insular, to me is just really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I like, and you're right to point out that people might be able to use it in this kind of like, I don't know, very broad way. As if everyone says, oh yeah, I live in this insular territory. And that's, how do they identify where they lived, what they associated with? That's complicated.
Local lord, village, family.
Mhm. And with family and social networks, that's really how they identified, because that's what made them who they were. It's what gave them their resources and support. It was really that family and social network. So this whole idea even of identifying by region, I think, is kind of dodgy for a while.
Thanks.
Sure.